Russia is likely preparing to conduct a massive hybrid attack on Ukraine in the near future, using missiles and Iranian-made drones. Humeniuk explained that Russia's stockpile of missiles is already exceeding the limit of their inviolable stockpile, so they might use mixed practices. In addition, she believes that the Russians are concerned about the quality of Ukrainian air defense, so they are trying to use wave-like tactics to identify air defense positions and attack them as well. Humeniuk also noted the increased activity of Russian reconnaissance aircraft. Russia has been attacking Ukraine's power system since the beginning of autumn. The first strike was in Kharkiv and Poltava oblasts on September 11, and the first massive attack throughout Ukrainian territory occurred on October 10. Since then, Russian forces have been launching missile strikes or attacking Ukrainian energy facilities using kamikaze drones, loitering munitions, every week or two. The last massive missile strike was carried out by the Russian Federation on December 31. 12 out of more than 20 missiles have been shot down. Drone attacks took place on New Year's Eve, 45 Shahid UAVs were shot down, and on the night of 1 to 2 January, about 40 drones were shot down. Ukraine said its troops were holding out against pro-Moscow forces in the eastern salt mining town of Soledar as more than 500 civilians including children were trapped there. Fighting. The ultranationalist contract militia Wagner, run by an ally of Russian President Putin, claims to have taken Soledar after intense fighting that it said had left the town strewn with Ukrainian dead. Moscow has held off officially proclaiming victory. Ukraine has acknowledged Russian advances and said fighting was still fierce in Soledar. A capture of Soledar, which had a pre-war population 10,000, would be Moscow's most substantial gain since a series of retreats throughout much of the second half of 2022. Moscow's February invasion of Ukraine, the biggest land war in Europe since World War II, has resulted in more than 50,000 reports of alleged war crimes, said Ukraine's top war crimes prosecutor Yuri Borisov. The reports of alleged torture by pro-Moscow forces include electric shocks to genitals and other parts of the body, beatings, various forms of suffocation and sexual violence. Military. Kremlin watchers are examining Russia's latest switch of battlefield leadership after Valery Gerasimov, chief of the military's general staff, was unexpectedly given direct command of the invasion. Russia could raise the upper age limit for citizens to be conscripted as soon as this spring, a senior lawmaker has said, as part of Moscow's plans to boost the number of Russian troops by 30%. The commander of Russian ground forces visited Ukraine's neighbor Belarus to inspect a joint force stationed there. For now, northwest Ukraine's border with Belarus is a landscape of burst river banks, thick mud and waterlogged fields, so a Russian assault from there soon seems unlikely. Economy. Russian state budget revenue from oil taxes declined in December to 511.7 billion rubles, $7.6 billion, the lowest since March 2021, according to data from the Finance Ministry, following a slide in oil prices. Car sales in Russia collapsed by 58.8% in 2022, the Association of European Businesses, AEB, said, as the industry reels from the impact of Western sanctions. Russia may start drafting men as old as 30 this spring under a plan outlined by a senior legislator as the military pushes to expand its ranks after it lost ground in Ukraine. Russia's commander of land forces, Oleg Salyukov, visited Belarus a day after his superior, Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, took over the combined forces in the invasion. Ukrainian troops were fighting to keep control of Soledar and Bakhmut in the eastern Donetsk region. Fierce fighting continues in Soledar as Russian attempts to capture the town in the eastern region of Donetsk are failing, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said during a video briefing. Russia is likely to increase efforts to capture the part of Zaporizhia region on the left bank of Dnipro River, said Ukrainian General Staff Representative Alexei Hromov. Russian forces hit Zaporizhia with missiles overnight, damaging private buildings and infrastructure facilities. To the east, Ukrainian troops repelled attacks near 12 settlements in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, including Bakhmut. One person was killed as Russia units shelled a settlement near the city of Kherson Thursday afternoon, Regional Governor Yaroslav Yanushevich said on Telegram. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin underscored his support for Sweden's quest to join NATO after meeting that country's defense minister, Pal Johnson, on Thursday. In a tweet, Austin also thanked Sweden for its security assistance to Ukraine. Asked about the new tensions between Turkey and Sweden, John Kirby, a spokesman for the U.S. National Security Council, said President Joe Biden continues to firmly support Sweden's accession. Kirby said the fate of 2 towns under Russian assault in the Donbass region isn't crucial to the war's outcome. Ukraine returned the bodies of 54 prisoners who were killed by an explosion in a detention facility in Olenivka in a Russian-occupied part of the Donetsk region last year, the Ministry for Reintegration of Occupied Territories said on its website. The International Red Cross helped in mediation to arrange the return. Ukraine called the attack on Olenivka in July a Russian war crime. The bodies still have to be identified as part of an ongoing larger investigation of the Olenivka shelling. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he doesn't expect strategic decisions on his country's ascension to NATO when the alliance's leaders meet in Vilnius, Lithuania, in July. More than 2.4 million of Ukrainians live in homes and apartment blocks damaged or ruined as a result of Russia's aggression, Infrastructure Minister Oleksandr Kubrikov said on Facebook. More than 316,000 Ukrainians have already applied for state compensation via a digital government service, he said. Putin last month not only endorsed boosting the size of Russia's army to 1.5 million from the current 1.15 million, but also approved a plan to raise the draft age to 21 to 30 years of age from the current 18 to 27. Lithuania needs to increase production of anti-drone weapons to assist Ukraine and to meet its own military needs, said President Gitanas Nausėda. Nausėda also said NATO should find formulas on how to offer Ukraine security guarantees before membership in the military alliance can be considered. He said he hopes to find a way to move forward on that at the NATO leaders' summit in Vilnius in July. As the Russia-Ukraine war nears the end of its first year, Moscow is struggling to find leverage to wear down Western resolve to aid Kyiv. With its battlefield wins now few and far between, an economy crippled by harsh sanctions, and increasing international isolation, Russian President Vladimir Putin is running out of options to expand its provocations beyond Ukraine to chip away at international support for Ukraine's resistance, experts say. When Moscow rolled its forces into Ukraine on February 24, Russia expected the country to quickly surrender, failing to anticipate a mountain of resistance. Among the roadblocks for Moscow was the resolve of the Ukrainian people, the leadership of the then untested Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the ill-prepared Kremlin troops. Failed attempts, Moscow has tried to weaken global resolve to aid Kyiv, using cyber attacks, shipping blockades to prevent crucial grain exports, freezing gas supplies for Europe and threatening to halt all energy imports, a move Putin said would cause the continent to freeze. But a warm winter combined with an international community that has collectively responded to each Russian threat with its own pushback, either through bolstered cyber defenses, energy replacements or economic sanctions, has kept Putin on his back foot. Limited bandwidth. Now, after more than 320 days of a conflict the Russian leader initially claimed would last less than a week, Moscow is all but out of ways to wreak havoc outside of Ukraine. Other losses. Further limiting Putin's options was Russia's swift loss of economic relations with the West, a forfeiture of decades of painstakingly cultivated ties and an ousting from an information network Moscow can no longer use to its advantage. Ukrainian defense officials are zeroing in on tank deliveries from the US and European partners, saying the firepower and security provided by the armored artillery vehicles will keep up the momentum in its efforts to rout invading Russian forces. The Biden administration has increased the heavy artillery it is providing Ukraine, but has done so slowly and incrementally to protect against perceptions that Washington is provoking Russian President Vladimir Putin. Pushing for tanks, Ukrainian officials have welcomed the Biden administration's recent announcement to supply armored vehicles with machine guns, Bradley fighting vehicles, but are pushing for Washington to commit to sending Abrams tanks. An important signal. Ukrainian officials say an announcement by the Biden administration that it would supply tanks would send an important political signal to Putin and Russia that the US and its allies are united in their support. And it would also push back against concerns that a new Republican House majority threatens bipartisan backing for Kyiv, or that Europe's solidarity is fracturing in the face of Moscow's havoc, they say. What's needed, Valery Zaluzhnyi, commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, told The Economist last month that Kyiv needs 300 tanks to achieve a decisive victory on the battlefield against Russia, along with 700 infantry fighting vehicles and 500 howitzers. Hundreds of Russian draftees reportedly fear they have been sent on a suicide mission by top military officials who are planning to conceal their deaths through an inventive new scheme, changing records to show they are part of a regiment that doesn't exist. SOTA reports that they've obtained an audio message recorded by some of the draftees, appealing for help on behalf of the 400 men who hail from the Altai Republic. In it they say they're being sent to storm an area near Svatov in Ukraine's Luhansk region. The men described manipulation of their official paperwork that effectively rendered them lost without a trace. The move suggests Russian officials are desperate for some manpower after military analysts noted Ukrainian troops had gained more ground on the Svatov-Kremenna line in recent days. Draftees from Russia's Tomsk region had also publicly appealed to the governor in November for help with a difficult situation near Svatov. As the Kremlin now preps for a large-scale war against Ukraine, military officials are apparently hell-bent on making the most of the cannon fodder already on the battlefield. The independent news outlet Agentstvo reported on Thursday that wounded troops are being tossed back on the front line without any official sign-off from doctors. "We do not have a trained mobilization reserve for waging a large-scale war, if NATO unleashes it. 1 out of every 10 has served in the army, and 9 out of 10 people have not served in the army. What kind of reserve are they making?" Viktor Sobolyev, a member of the committee, told local media on Wednesday. He said 100% of young people should be required to train for a military specialty. Ukraine said its troops were holding out against pro-Moscow forces in the eastern salt mining town of Soledar as more than 500 civilians, including children, were trapped there. In a video address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday thanked 2 units in Soledar that he said are holding their positions and inflicting significant losses on the enemy. He did not give more details. Zelensky said he and senior Ukrainian commanders analyzed the need for reinforcements in Soledar and nearby towns in the eastern industrial area known as the Donbass and next steps for the coming days. Russia's ultranationalist contract militia Wagner Group, run by an ally of President Vladimir Putin, claimed to have taken Soledar after intense fighting that it said left the town strewn with Ukrainian dead. Moscow, however, has held off officially proclaiming a victory, which would be its first significant gain in 6 months. Donetsk Governor Pavlo Kirilenko told Ukrainian state TV that 559 civilians remained in Soledar, including 15 children, and could not be evacuated from the community that had a pre-war population of about 10,000. If Russia captured Soledar, it would likely use that position to intensify its assault on Bakhmut. Soledar is also home to cavernous salt mines, which could be a commercially lucrative asset. Across Ukraine, the front lines have barely budged since Russia's last big retreat in the south 2 months ago. Kyiv hopes heavy armor from Western allies will allow it to resume advances. Western countries have started to offer Kyiv advanced weaponry like the sophisticated U.S. Patriot missile system. The United States, Germany and France last week pledged armored fighting vehicles, and Ukraine's latest requests have focused on battle tanks. Polish President Andrzej Duda promised Ukraine 14 German-made Leopard battle tanks. Zelensky told Polish state-run broadcaster TVP Info that this could pave the way for other countries to do the same. Britain is considering sending tanks. Fighting continues in Soledar, Donetsk Oblast. The Russians struck the city 91 times during a day, while the defense forces killed more than 100 invaders. Quote from Cherevadii, "Fighting is ongoing in Soledar, and the enemy has concentrated its main efforts there. First of all, the most trained units of the Wagner PMC and units of other branches of the Russian Federation. The enemy is making constant strikes. In particular, during the day, 91 artillery strikes were made on Soledar. However, our rocket forces and artillery units concentrated their efforts to knock out the enemy as much as possible. In particular, more than 100 occupiers were killed by artillery and rockets during that day. In total, 42 combat engagements took place on this front over the course of the day. The defense forces are trying to worsen the logistics of the Russian forces, destroying storage points in particular. For this reason, according to Cherevadii, the occupiers were instructed not to unload weapons closer than 100 kilometers from the contact line. The armed forces hit the cluster of Russian equipment and personnel, primarily with high-precision systems such as HIMARS and MLRS. Hanna Maliar confirms that the Russians continue their offensive in the area of Soledar. Senator Jack Reed is calling for the Biden administration to equip Ukraine with a longer-range tactical missile system and also expressing support for a new wave of attacks on Russian forces. He said Wednesday that he understands, based on his recent discussions with Zelensky and Ukrainian military officials, that Ukraine needs the longer-range missiles to continue targeting Russian forces' logistics and command posts and to keep its forward momentum and hopefully in the spring start conducting extensive offensive operations. Many of Ukraine's gains last year were aided by missiles from the shorter-range guided multiple rocket launch system, he said. The GMRLS missiles have a range of roughly 60 miles, Reid said. Russian commanders are trying to keep themselves and their depots beyond the range of the GMRLS missiles, Reid said. For this reason, Reid sees a role for the Army tactical missile system, whose missiles have a range of roughly 100 miles, he said. Reid said he has discussed the missile range issue with Zelensky and also with members of the Ukrainian military. He emphasizes the importance of being confident that Ukraine would fire the longer-range tactical missiles only at targets within its territory and not into Russia. The Biden administration has not yet announced any decision on Ukraine's request for the longer-range missiles. Despite numerous statements by Russian sources, according to ISW, Russian troops have not yet fully captured Soledar, and even the possible capture of the town is unlikely to allow Russian troops to take Bakhmut. Analysts note that Russia's statements about the Russian offensive in Soledar provoked a discussion in the Russian pro-war community about the possibility of capturing Bakhmut, with some sources discussing the implausible development of events, the collapse of the Ukrainian front and the retreat of the Ukrainian armed forces to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. ISW believes that the appointment of the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Army Valery Gerasimov as commander of Russian troops in Ukraine is an attempt by the Kremlin to create conditions for both improving Russian command and control of troops and intensifying Russian operations in Ukraine. Putin's decision to announce the changes publicly indicates that the Kremlin views Gerasimov's appointment as a major change, both in the actual conduct of the war and in the formal role of the Russian Defense Ministry, ISW writes. This move and the overall restructuring of the command are likely intended to demonstrate both internationally and within Russia Putin's willingness to wage a protracted war in Ukraine and the Kremlin's commitment to the traditional structures of the Russian Defense Ministry. Putin's two main goals in the new appointments are an attempt to better manage Russia's operations for the decisive 2023 war, as well as a political desire to strengthen the Russian Defense Ministry amid growing challenges from a notional group of Siloviki, including Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner mercenary company. Although Gerasimov's appointment may be explained by Russia's intention to resume offensive operations in 2023, Putin has repeatedly demonstrated that he does not understand the actual capabilities of the Russian armed forces. The ISW believes that the Russian dictator's calculation of the Russian army's ability to launch a successful major offensive this year is probably wrong. Putin may also be aware of the threat of further Ukrainian counteroffensive operations in 2023 and expect that Gerasimov is able to strengthen Russian forces to withstand these likely attacks. The formal elevation of Gerasimov and the Russian Defense Ministry over General Sergei Surovikin, a favorite of Prigozhin and the radical group of Siloviki, was also partly a political decision in the desire to restore the primacy of the Russian Defense Ministry in the internal Russian power struggle, ISW believes. Since the end of 2022, Prigozhin has been increasingly critical of the Russian Defense Ministry, relentlessly promoting the Wagner units at the expense of the MOD's reputation. The inability of the Russian military-industrial complex to solve the problem of ammunition shortages will likely prevent Russia from sustaining offensive operations in eastern Ukraine in 2023. ISW draws this conclusion from CNN reports with reference to representatives of the United States and Ukraine. On January 10, it was reported that the daily intensity of Russian artillery fire decreased in some areas by 75%, which is a historical minimum since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Sources told CNN that Russian forces may be rationing their artillery shells more strictly due to dwindling stockpiles or reconsidering their tactics. Serhiy Cherevatiy, the spokesman for the Eastern Group of Forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, said that in the summer of 2022, Russian troops depleted their reserves of 122mm and 152mm artillery pieces and other resources, falsely believing that intensive artillery fire would lead to faster results. According to Cherevatiy, the Russian army is now forced to transfer additional shells from the rear of Russia and purchase extra ammunition from foreign countries to compensate for such shortages, which has led to a decrease in the rate of fire. Russian sources also increasingly acknowledge that the lack of ammunition is seriously hampering the advance of Russian troops in Ukraine. One military commander said on federal TV that Russia's mobilization efforts are inadequate and that its results on the front line depend more on the economy and the military-industrial complex. Earlier, ASW pointed out that the mobilization and other efforts of the Kremlin to build up the manpower of the army are unlikely to affect the course of the war unless Russia solves its fundamental problems with providing supplies to its military operations in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that a renewed Russian offensive from Belarus remains unlikely. During a meeting on the security of Ukraine's northwestern borders on January 11, Zelensky said that Ukraine does not see any significant changes in Belarus, apart from strong statements, although Ukraine will prepare these sections of the border for any situation. In addition, on January 11, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reiterated that it has not observed the formation of enemy assault groups in Belarus. ISW also continues to believe that a renewed invasion of northern Ukraine against Kyiv is unlikely. Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly issued secret and preemptive pardons to Russian convicts fighting with the Wagner Group in Ukraine, potentially further empowering Wagner to operate with impunity in the theater, and will also allow its leader Yevgeny Prigozhin to use the promise of pardons to stimulate recruitment, thereby supplying even more untrained and unprofessional personnel to the front as a depleting force that often commits atrocities. Russian forces continued limited counterattacks near Svatov as Ukrainian forces continued counteroffensive operations near Kreminna and struck rear areas in Luhansk Oblast. Russian claims about Wagner Group and conventional Russian military formations operations in the Soledar area likely reflect competing claims over the responsibility for the most recent notable Russian tactical advances in Ukraine. Russian forces conducted ground attacks across the Donetsk Oblast frontline. Ukrainian officials reported that Russian forces are withdrawing key assets and restructuring logistics networks in southern Ukraine due to Ukrainian strikes. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced a plan to improve the Russian defense industrial base. Emine Zaparova, First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, has announced that the UN General Assembly will vote on establishing a special tribunal to investigate Russia's crime of aggression. She has stressed that the right of force, which Russia is barbarically practicing against Ukraine, gives a clear signal to everyone present in this room: nobody is safe anymore. If a country abuses the rights and privileges of a permanent member of the Security Council and attacks another UN member state, it can only mean one thing: safety is ruined, international peace is jeopardized, and the rule of law is brutally violated, Zaparova stated. She reminded the public that almost 88 years ago, the USA, Great Britain, France and the Soviet Union signed the London Agreement and the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, which paved the way for the Nuremberg process. This is what we must do today to create a special tribunal for the investigation of the crime of aggression, she added. Back in December, the media reported that a project for the tribunal creation resolution was circulating in the UN with the aim of prosecuting the Russian authorities for the crimes of aggression in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, considering the punishment of the Russian Federation for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, believes it will be appropriate to focus on already existing institutions and not on the creation of new ones. At the same time, the International Criminal Court cannot investigate Russia's crime of aggression if both sides of the conflict are not the participants of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Neither Ukraine nor Russia have ratified this statute.